Hi, everyone. I am Kelly, and this is Vote Her In. Vote Her In is a collaboration between Two Broads Talking Politics and Rebecca Sive, who's been my longtime collaborator on this. Rebecca is the author of Vote Her In, Your Guide to Electing Our First Woman President. And I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca now, who will introduce our guest tonight. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Kelly, and really delighted. This is a very special evening. Actually, every Voter In show is a very special evening in my book. But we're here talking with two amazing women. And in the context of Voter In and the idea of electing a woman president, I just want to point out something which we'll say a little bit more clearly as we discuss this evening, that, the opportunity for women to be engaged in public life is, in fact, based on what we're going to talk about tonight, which is women's ability to control their reproductive health and be autonomous in that way. And in that context, I want to tell you, I'm just really honored, I have to say, that Kitty Kolbert, which is how I know her, Kathryn Kolbert when you write about her, and Julie Kay have written this amazing book. You can see it behind Kitty on the shelf there. I will hold it up. Controlling Women, What We Must Do Now to Save Our Reproductive Freedom, which is based on the notion, and they're going to talk about it, that the current U.S. Supreme Court is likely, perhaps with the Mississippi case or something else, to overturn Roe in its next term. And they lay out an amazing set of facts, of history, of ideas for the future. So they're going to talk about that. I do, though, want to give you a bit of background and bio for the two of them, because I think it's important for you to know the degree of expertise of these two really distinguished lawyers and brilliant authors. As it happens, I think Kitty and I have known each other for about 30 years. When she argued Casey in the Supreme Court in 1992, and she'll talk a bit about that, there was a march of about 500,000 women from around the country a few weeks before. And I was one of those 500,000, and it may have been around that time we met. But in any event, she had, at around that time, been one of the people who founded the Center for Reproductive Rights, and has really been a cornerstone kind of a person for this issue, named by the National Law Journal as one of the 100 most influential lawyers in America in terms of public service, which of course is where my heart is, also by American Lawyer as one of 45 public interest lawyers whose vision and commitment are changing lives. So I think it's fair to say, and think about this as we talk with Kitty and Julie, that we have all of us, Kitty, to thank for our right to reproductive health as it stands right now. Julie, like Kitty, was also an attorney at the Center for Reproductive Rights, which, for those of you who may not know it, is the primary organization that has litigated these matters, although the ACLU and others have certainly done so. And it really importantly, and she's going to talk about this here as well, and it's talked about in the book, she was responsible for the first direct challenge, as she put it, laying the groundwork for legalization of abortion in Ireland, which had an absolute ban in the case ABC v. Ireland before the European Court of Human Rights. And I confess not to understand the import of all that, but that's what Julie is going to educate us about, and I'm looking forward to that. I think that, as I mentioned a moment ago, I want to just give you a quote here, and where Kitty, to contextualize what we're going to talk about, where Kitty and Julie sit is the same place I think many of us sit, which is that unless we have this right, we don't have much in terms of being able to live our lives as we ought to be able to. And so I found this quote, thanks to Kitty for correcting the attribution for me. I read that it was said by Justice O'Connor, and it didn't ring true, but I believed what I read, which was foolish. So it does come from a dissenting opinion by Justice Blackmun in another important reproductive rights case, Webster v. Reproductive Health, citing political scientist, feminist extraordinaire Roz Pachevsky. And here we go. The ability of women to participate equally in the economic and social life of the nation has been facilitated by their ability to control their reproductive lives. So that is our theme. So we're going to dig into the book and learn from Kitty and Julie about what we need to think about, what we need to know, and how we should keep on moving here. So to jump right in, I want to ask them if they would to give us basically an account, sort of the background of why they decided this was the time to write this book and get it out there. What was the trajectory of events that made it seem like this was the time to do so? So welcome, and if we can talk both about the U.S. and about the Irish experience, however the two of you want to divide it up, welcome and thanks for being here.
Well, thanks so much, Rebecca. It's really great to see you, and it's been way too long since we've been able to be together in person, but I'm thrilled to be here. Let me start by just saying that maybe it was the day Donald Trump was elected president, but certainly soon thereafter, it became very clear to all of us that the Supreme Court was likely to see new members who would be opposed to abortion. And I've said for years, arguing or litigating abortion rights is a lot like Sesame Street. You got to learn to count. The number that's key is 5. And currently on the Supreme Court, thanks to the additions that President Trump added, there are 6 votes of people who are against abortion. Now, some of them may only want to so diminish the right that on paper, there seems to be something left, others of which are perfectly explicit and are willing to say, overrule Casey, overrule Roe, send this matter back to the states, let the states do what they want, including the banning of abortion. And just to put that dire thought into reality, the first case that will enable them to do so will be heard in sometime this fall, probably October, maybe November. It's a case out of Mississippi. It's a ban on abortion after 15 weeks. And that just puts right into the court the question of does the Supreme Court recognize the right to choose abortion? What and how fundamental is that right? How important is that right? And will they return the question to the states? And I'm going to let Julie add a little bit here, but I think the key here is people say, oh, no, they can't do that. It can't happen. Well, we lay out in the book pretty convincingly that the court almost did so in 1992. In fact, in Justice Blackmun's papers, there is an opinion written by Justice Rehnquist overturning Roe and sending the matter back to the states. It was only the last minute shift in a vote by Justice Kennedy that changed that preserved what we now know as Casey as the standard, as the law. But they almost did it, and they could do it again. In fact, in our view, they're very, very, very likely to do it again.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I'm delighted to be here. I love talking politics and politics about broads and with broads. So thank you for having us on. I think that what Kitty says shows the 2 reasons why we wrote this book. I mean, the first one is that we're tired of banging our heads against the Supreme Court walls. They're just not our friends. The federal courts are not our friends. And so we need a new model, but we've needed a new model for a while. I mean, when Kitty argued the Planned Parenthood versus Casey case, it was a victory, but it also opened the door to decades of chipping away at rights and access to abortions through waiting periods and through other kinds of unnecessary regulations and restrictions on abortion. And even before the 1990s, back in 1976, with the Hyde Amendment, we had a ban on federal funding of abortion. And what we've seen and what women have experienced is that these restrictions really have a disproportionate impact on women who are low income, on women of color, on women who live in rural areas, on teens. So we haven't been in a great place for a while. And I think what Kitty and I, in our conversations with colleagues and in our work, we've really looked at ways to expand access. And the way to do it is not to keep trying to save Roe, unfortunately. And so this book really looks at, what is the way forward? And a lot of what I sort of learned in Ireland about the human rights model is one that, the grass is always greener in Ireland, but also when you look outside the US, what are some of the models that have worked and where have people really been able to demand an access to their rights and not kind of had this, well, you don't believe in what I'm doing with my body and with my ability to participate in the workplace, with my ability to decide who to have sex with, who to have babies with, who to not have babies with, who to marry, all those kinds of really intimate decisions. In the US, we have this real kind of don't tread on me right to individualism, except when it comes to controlling women and their sexuality and controlling LGBTQ plus folks and their sexuality. That really gets dictated to us. So what we want to do is really look at, okay, how do we redefine and approach this issue, bring in new allies, and really have a much more sort of assertive demanding of our rights.
So I want to follow up on this idea of states and, potentially throwing things back to the states and what that would look like. And so, we know that over the past several decades that there's been this increasing rush of legislation in the states, in the state legislatures, to circumscribe women's access to abortion.
Kelly, can you hear us?
So it sounds like Kelly has dropped off, but I understand what she was getting at, which is, what is the state of the states? What's going to happen if the question is returned to the states? And I think we think that at a minimum, there are 23 what I call trifecta states that are controlled by the Republicans in the state legislatures and in the gubernatorial seats. That means they have total control. They will take that and use that power to eliminate abortion for as many women as they can. We think there's 23 of them, so that's over a third of the states. Another 17 states are trifecta blue or controlled by the Democrats, and that means that they're likely to pass laws that protect women's ability to obtain abortions. What does that mean geographically? Well, it means the South and the West, the mountain states are primarily anti-abortion, and you got the coasts and the Northeast, somewhat parts of the Midwest, in which women will have greater access. The real trick here, though, is not so much as the likelihood of banning, but what happens to women who are living in the bad states. We'll get to what we can do about it, but what happens to those women? In the days before Roe, those women had illegal back alley abortions, and some died. Some lost their fertility. Some had, the inability to have babies in the future. It was a horrendous circumstance for those women. Today, I think we have a difference because of the availability of medical abortion, which is you're able to take a couple of pills and terminate a pregnancy. There are protocols that need to be followed. There are health, but women can do that on their own. They don't need to go to a back alley practitioner. It will, however, be a really important thing to be able to get the help that women need to where they are. And again, what I worry about is poor women, young women, that litany of people that Julie talked about, who don't have access now, will continue not to have access when abortion is banned. And for them, the lack of access is more catastrophic than it is today.
And one of the things we've really focused on in looking at the book is what works. If you're in a blue state, you can create hubs and resources and access for women and for people who are traveling. If you're in a red state, it may look somewhat different. So we looked at a lot of different kinds of legislative initiatives, whether it was sort of an omnibus one or whether it was um, access to medication, abortion through telemedicine, those kinds of things. And then we also looked at the federal level in the long game because we are, optimists, sometimes begrudging, sometimes gray cloud optimists, but we really wanted to see what we could do with the federal constitution as well. And we wanted to look for a way of kind of supercharging it and really making this constitution modern and aware of the gender equity issues and race equity issues that play out to the abortion debate. So in the book, we discuss in depth what we call a gender equity amendment. And it's kind of modeled on the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, and that history and what the goals were there. And it really looks at kind of inserting a little bit more of a proactive human rights based approach to gender equity into the Constitution. And we don't map out the details of every line of what it would look like, but we talk about a lot of different models because we think that this is something that, the pro gender equity, pro choice, pro women's rights movement needs a long term plan. We need everyday action, and we have a lot of steps that people kind of get up off the couch and do what works for you. And then we also need to really, get to a place where the legal system is our friend and is a way of asserting these kinds of rights that we need to participate in life.
When I was reading the book and I came across this amendment proposal that you lay out, I actually wrote it out here. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about, specifically about the language and the way you constructed this notion of an amendment that really relates to all aspects of, women's health, women's reproductive health, their role as mothers, their role as, sex partners. I mean, give us a feel for the, so to speak, for how broad you're looking at that and why that's the way you've chosen to think about an amendment to the Constitution, which in life I couldn't have imagined. It was like stunning to read it.
Well, it's interesting, Rebecca, because we started talking about a constitutional amendment when I was at the ACLU back in 1992. So this is an idea that I've been playing with for a long time. And one of the things that we have really seen in recent years is how the rise of social movements like the LGBTQ plus movement, like the Black Lives Matter movement, has really focused and changed how we think about social justice. It's a much more broad-based approach that utilizes all of our energies across disciplines. And it seems to me that the point of our book is that the question of abortion, the question of reproductive freedom is not just about the medical procedure of abortion, but it's about controlling women, it's about misogyny. And until we're able to, and it's about controlling who you have sex with. And that affects other social justice movements as well, very radically, the LGBT plus community. So I think what we're saying is any amendment that we work so hard to get, it could be 50 years to get there, ought to be inclusive of everything we want. One that involves racial justice, one that involves lesbian and gay rights and trans rights, one that involves rights for women, not just to have one medical procedure, but rights of women to be equal within our society as a whole.
And what is your thought of just pursuing this topic a bit? What is your thought about why this is, in your view, right now, a politically smart proposal to make, given the context we're presently in?
Well, go ahead, Julie.
I mean, to be trite, the best defense is a good offense, but I think we need something proactive. We need something that's much more contemporary with where we are in our lives, that's much more demanding of our rights. And when you look outside the United States and you see, we're one of 4 countries that in the world that has not signed the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. I think we're down there with some very anti-feminist countries, and we need to sign it, we need to ratify it, and we really need to look at what does the government have to do to get us to this basic level where it's safe to have a baby in this country. No matter how much money you have, no matter where you live, that kind of basic access to health care is something that is not dependent on your employer. It's not dependent on your zip code, those kinds of things. So what we're proposing, I think, really meets people where they're at as far as we know this is a right, we know this is important, and we can't just keep going with the same kind of framing where it's a private decision and it's how much money you have for these kinds of really basic aspects of our lives and most intimate decision making. So is it something that we think would pass even, the most friendly Congress today? No, but we have to start somewhere. And I think that's, one of the reasons that we think there's something for everybody to do in this book. And we've seen some states that have been looking at putting these kinds of constitutional provisions in their constitutions. Some state constitutions already have some gender rights clauses in them, but we're really looking at models worldwide at the state level in the US as well. And we want to dream big for this and be audacious.
Let me just say, our opponents had a 50-year plan that they started in 1973 and is today coming to fruition. And it seems to me, if the courts aren't our friend, if we cannot depend on the Supreme Court to preserve our liberties, we need a 50-year plan. And part of that is a long-term plan, and part of that is what can we do tomorrow? And we've got to do all of those things. And I think the bottom line in all of this is you don't get anywhere in this country without political power. Rebecca, you know this better than anyone. You've been writing books about political power for women. And that's what this is about. We need the political power to enact legislatively many of the solutions we list in the book. But we can't do that unless all of us are committed to making change in whatever way we can.
So one of the things about a 50-year plan is thinking about the next generation. And so I am a mom of boys, and, I always assumed I'd be a mom of girls and would be raising strong feminist girls. And I had boys who are wonderful. But I wanted to talk about raising feminist boys and the things we should be thinking about as we're teaching this next generation, not just in helping our girls think about these issues, but in helping our boys think about these issues as well. And I wonder if you could talk about that.
Well, Kelly, you kind of gave me some warning about that question. So I emailed my son, who is 36, and said, what was the magic sauce in raising? And he said, well, it just was he took it for granted. He said, when you have the Tampax on the toilet, those are just the things that it's part of everyday life. And I'm very proud of him. And he is definitely a feminist. But part of what I think is so important and what we talk a lot about in the book is these issues are about gender equity, which means that both men and women have to change how we view the family, how we view our roles in raising children, how we view whether or not to have children. And those families aren't the traditional, mom, dad, and Ozzie and Harriet anymore. I mean, I'm a lesbian. We had two children. My wife and I had two children, 36 years ago. That was a long time. But today that happens all the time because the notion of family is changing. And I think we need to really think seriously about how we help boys understand that they can do anything they want, even if it's not the traditional thing. That is, they can be ballerinas too, right? They can dress up and it. The point is we need to have a new look at what gender means and make sure that both boys and girls understand that when you limit particular roles in particular ways, you harm both the girls and the boys going forward.
And I think, we've learned a lot about allyship, especially in the past few years. I mean, we've learned as a white person, I've learned how can I be an ally to people of color, and what does that mean? What's my role in that? When do you speak up? When do you shut up? When do you protest? When do you support? And I think what we need to do in the reproductive rights movement is very similar to what we've seen with the LGBTQ plus campaign around marriage equality that Kitty and I look at a lot in the book, as well as the Black Lives Matter activism of how do we speak to people and form coalitions and really take on each other's issues and be real partners. And I think that applies to everybody in gender equity. As Kitty said, gender stereotypes are harmful for everybody. I think I've been really excited to see people who are really pushing at the edges of the gender binary, because I think that serves all of us. And I grew up on Free to Be You and Me. I have two daughters who kind of listen to it and laugh now, but I think, for better or for worse, the messages are still very relevant. And, having those conversations, and, in the book, we talk specifically about sex education and teaching people how to be aware of themselves and their partners and what consent is. And I think that's really important as well.
So when you speak about coalitions, and of course this gets to the heart of one of the primary concerns we have here, which is women's political power specifically, and Kitty alluded to that before, I'm wondering what your thoughts are specifically about, if you were talking with the women who are considering running for office, the women who are now in office, what kinds of strategies and tactics would you like them to consider to sort of further this, notion that you're talking about in this constitutional amendment in particular?
Well, somebody suggested we send a copy of the book to every woman state legislator, every pro-choice state legislator. We're hoping we can do that. But to me, the most important thing they can do is to resist, to fight back, to be loud in their opposition. Because if we're talking about, I don't know if you all followed the controversy in Texas with this new state law that just is, in my view, one of the most insidious laws you can ever imagine. They ban abortion, and then they give the rights to any private person to be a vigilante for the anti-abortion cause. And that was passed, but did we even hear about that in the news? Not for weeks and weeks and weeks. And so to me, what state legislators can do in the bad states is to resist, but not just to resist loudly. And our coalitions need to resist loudly. I mean, think about that young woman in Texas who stood up at her high school graduation and tore up the speech and spoke her mind. That was inspiring for all of us. It was a notion of resistance that I think is really important. And in the good states, be a model for others. Pass as much as you can, as quickly as you can, and then help, if you live in a blue state, help the purple states turn blue. One of the things we saw in the last election were people from all over the country contributing to state legislative campaigns in states like my own in Pennsylvania, which are purple states. And it's really, really important that funding base enable legislators to make the run, because it's hard enough to win, but you certainly can't win without the resources. And lastly, and again, Rebecca, this is your mantra, so I don't know why I'm saying it. You should be saying it. We need more women to run for office. There are, I think, close to 6,000 positions of political power in this country, from school boards to the presidency. We need women in over 50% of those positions.
There's actually, according to Vote Run Lead, there's 500,000 public offices that women could be in, right? There's also the truth that we sometimes...
It was a little less. I said 600,000, it was 500.
Right, but it may be almost 600 by now, who knows? I mean, if you're in a state like Illinois, where they love to have lots of municipalities so they can issue tax bills or whatever. But before we finish, just one more follow-up question on this point. You're talking about resisting, about passing legislation, about encouraging women to run and become powerful. In the research you did for the book and the digging that you did to tell us your story and this strategy, were there particular messages that you think are key for those of us who are advocating for women to run for office, helping them run, that you would suggest that we bear in mind on this particular front as we work with those women?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we keep seeing over and over is these issues are winning issues. These are issues that people care deeply about, and that, we've been used to being on the defense a little bit. I think what we really want people to know, and especially people who are running for office, is that people want leadership on this. People want you to say, we're going to win. This is a human right. We want access to health care. We want to make the decision whether to have an abortion or whether to carry a pregnancy to term and start a family. And we've seen so much success with a lot of the women of color who have come into office. And we talk a lot in the book about the Hyde Amendment, the federal ban on funding, and how that was really the whole game changed on that when Black women started speaking up and saying, this is harming us, this is unfair, this is disproportionately aimed at women of color and low income women. And the more we can be sort of outraged about things, the more we'll be heard. And, the numbers are there, the support is there. And it really is the human rights issue of our time.
Right. And I would just add is too many people today think save Roe, save Roe, save Roe is the strategy that we should continue down. We can't. We got to change tactics. We need to make sure that we find our liberties in other venues, state legislatures, in Congress, in the political process, in culture, but no longer in the federal courts.
So on that note, and there's lots more to talk about, I'm going to hold up this book again and tell everybody that find a way to get a hold of it, share it with your girlfriends, share it with the other women that you're organizing with. There's just so much here that we need to think about, and Kitty and Julie have just begun to share. So we want to end on the note of yes, we can, right? Yes, she can, and to join together so that the death of Roe, so to speak, is not the end of the road for us. It's just the beginning of a whole new way of being. So Julie and Kitty, thank you so much. I want to just turn to Kelly so she can give some parting words as well.
Yes, thank you. This, I think, is really inspirational in thinking this way. I think you're right that this idea of just save Roe is not enough and would be far too depressing when Roe collapses. So I'm so glad to be thinking about sort of what is beyond that. So thank you.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Thank you.